all that vitamin C is already causing oxidative stress, causing oxalate formation in the vascular system and wrecking my veins and making them all fibrotic.
That's crazy. And we think vitamin C is so good for us, but there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. Hey guys, thank you so much for supporting us and watching our videos. If you'd like to support us some more and get some of our merchandise like this awesome apron, be sure to check out our website at thecarnivorerevolution.com. Hey everybody, welcome to the Carnivore Revolution. My special guest today is Sally Norton. Sally is an author, a speaker. She has a bachelor's degree in nutritional science and a master's degree in public health. Sally wrote an awesome book called Toxic Superfoods. If you have not read that yet, it is an absolute must read. I had the privilege of talking to Sally in Dr. Chafee's book club meeting, and I'm really excited to be able to spend this time with her today. Sally, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun to meet people who've read the book.
Yeah, I love the book. It has so many details in it, things people never would guess about the vegetables. I just think that is such an important topic because I know so many people overdo it with the vegetables, thinking that we're doing the right thing. So I want to talk about your story first and what led you down this path of realizing that you were basically making yourself sick.
Jeez, I wish someone included me in when I was 4, because by the time I was 5, I was already really into like what you're supposed to eat and eating the right things. And I always loved food. So I was food oriented and pretty health oriented, pretty young. So it would have been nice to learn earlier, but I didn't learn this until I was 49 years old for real. And it was a big revelation to me that the foods that I've been trusting to keep me well and functional were actually undermining my health. And this is a brain exploding mess, like emotionally and otherwise. It's almost traumatic. So I can understand people are like, don't want to hear about it. But the truth is, if you get the truth, boy, does that set you free. And it just opened up my health in ways I'm just really was shocked by at the time, because I engaged in cutting out my sweet potatoes and Swiss chard and celery and kiwis, which was the remnants of oxalate, high oxalate foods in my diet, because I finally had recognized that eating those foods was increasing my arthritis symptoms and making me unable to function as well in yoga. Like I was degenerating in yoga class. I was doing Bikram hot yoga 3-4 times a week to survive. I was disabled at the time. I couldn't work anymore. And about all that I could do was pull off a few yoga classes. Couldn't do much else. And I was trying to fix this. It was coming from apparently a sleep problem. I was waking up 29 times an hour and didn't know it. I've been so exhausted for so long. I didn't even know I wasn't sleeping. And it took a sleep lab study after I had a hysterectomy and had to quit my work. And I didn't recover from the hysterectomy. And the doctors could not figure out what was going on. So they sent me to the sleep lab. And so I was spending 3 years trying to recover what's wrong with my sleep. None of the drugs were doing anything, of course. And realized that, it must be the dysbiosis toxicity, because it turns out it's toxicity that wrecks your brain and makes it hard to sleep. And the studies seem to always point to dysbiosis, which is the favorite theory of the day, that you've got some kind of imbalance of things growing in your colon and so on that's poisoning you. But what became clear was that as I was trying to fix the dysbiosis with a little bit of celery and juicing and some kiwi to fix the constipation and things, I was becoming more arthritic and stiff. And this was not good, because during my vegetarian years, I was really arthritic badly. I would swell up and become weak and could hardly do anything. When I was really stressed, my whole body could light up with pain and weakness. And that started when I was 12 and was particularly bad during my 20s. And I didn't want to go back there. Here I'm heading in my late 40s. So I decided I had to do this oxalate diet because the attempt to get my sleep better was making me more arthritic. And I was resentful that I had to do this diet to deal with arthritis when I wanted to fix my sleep problem so I could function and work again. But the surprising result of taking out the kiwi, sweet potato, and so on is that very quickly I could tell my brain was happier and that I must be sleeping better, because now I was able to read and focus. And then all kinds of other things happened. Yes, my arthritis got better and my energy got better. My ability to function was getting better. And within 6 months, my feet were better. I had real big problems with my feet that really got going when I started college. Hiking around on campuses with heavy books seemed to have wrecked my feet. I was actually exercising on a carpeted concrete floor in the mornings as a high school senior, and then through my years of starting college, and made me crippled. I had to leave Cornell, where I was studying for nutrition, for 4 years, and went back to school still with foot pain, even though during the interim I had foot surgery by one of the major foot doctors in the country and here in the US, flew to Ohio from central New York, where I was from, to have this foot surgery and all this. And I didn't recover from that surgery well. So I spent 8 years on crutches and painkillers and so on in my 20s for my feet problems. And I was still having arthritis despite all the drugs and everything. And it was much later when I really got good feet. And I spent the next 20 years after that not having great feet, needing shoes all the time, and not being able to rump john play. I would have loved to be able to do ultimate frisbee and racquetball and things like that. None of that was on the table for me at all. It might be now because my feet are fine now. And it was taking out sweet potatoes and chard and kiwi that fixed 30 years of foot problems. That was a big deal. I mean, my whole life has been hung up by health problems that were unexplained. And then by getting rid of the oxalates, it explained so much. I'm in a small ranch house because I wouldn't dare buy a split level that had stairs. I've spent so much time in crutches and wheelchairs. That's a disaster. I would never need to do that kind of thing now. Now I know that I'm fine and not falling apart, but I spent my entire adulthood compensating for being a cripple.
That's just, to me, that is so crazy that those are the kinds of things. Like what I really loved in your book was when you mentioned how, and this is, this just goes along with, some people would say, oh, well, you just have bad genes, or you just have bad luck, right? The way that you were throughout your whole adulthood. But in your book, you mentioned that so many of the things that we think are just normal, so many of the things that we think are just, as we're getting older, are actually just oxalates building up in our system. And to me, that's crazy, because at 50 years old, I just turned 50. I have friends who are buying a 1-story house because they don't want to have to go up and down stairs anymore. And, so many people have achy joints at, 45 and 50 years old. So many people have a hard time getting out of bed in the morning because they're so sore and achy. And to me, I would have agreed with that up until I started Carnivore and eliminated all those things. But I would have agreed with that because I had a hard time getting out of bed. I would sit on the end of the bed and I would say to my husband, ugh, is this just what 48 feels like? Like, I felt like I was getting old. And I cut out the fruits and vegetables. It had nothing to do with oxalates for me because I didn't know about them then, but I cut out fruits and vegetables. And I think it was just my body telling me those things aren't good for you, because I gave them up and could only eat meat, a couple of cuts of meat at the time, because of the horrible, horrible smell that so many other things had. And thank goodness I had that issue. I mean, I look back on it now, it was terrible. It's finally gone after 2 years and 8 months, but I look back on that and I'm really kind of grateful for it now.
Yeah, sometimes we have to hit the skids to discover gold. And it's nice when your body can speak so loudly that you can not fail to listen.
Yeah. And you mentioned juicing. I was a juicing fanatic. I juiced for 25 years off and on. I had my first juicer when I was 19, 14-day juice fasts. I mean, I did so many different things with juicing. I had my whole family drinking celery juice every morning because medical mediums said it was good for you. And I look back on those times and the times where I filled my kids' smoothies with spinach and kale, hoping they wouldn't notice, and when it turned green, I would cover it with whipped cream so they couldn't see what color it was. And my favorite thing to make when I was vegan was brownies made with garbanzo beans. And I told myself they tasted good. But those are some of the highest oxalate foods. The foods that I used to hide for my kids to make sure they would eat them are some of the highest oxalate foods. So the things that we think are superfoods that are actually really high in oxalates, things like broccoli, kale, beets and beet greens, things like that. We think they're superfoods, but they're really not.
That's the big problem, that people are following advice that's wrong. we're being misinformed. And even which foods are high in oxalate and which aren't, there's a complete confusion about that too, because actually broccoli and kale are relatively low compared to spinach, beet greens, and chard, which are off the charts high. And you do much better eating kale if you're cooking it and not overdoing it. And kale is part of this giant family of vegetables in the cabbage family that comes from the mustard plant. And that's all the forms of cabbage and even arugula and so on. So you can be eating a lot of those foods, and people like to do them raw. Medical medium is basically a raw vegetarian diet, isn't it? And
yeah, it is
not a good idea. It's high carb, it lacks a lot of nutrients, and it has these plant toxins that in plants that aren't cooked properly. Humans have always really cooked plants pretty hard in the past. You need to do that with something like a chickpea. You need to soak it for 3 days and then high pressure cook it, really cook the heck out of it, because it has other plant toxin, particularly the lectins in legumes, especially lentils, which are not high in oxalate. The highest oxalate beans are black beans in your standard burrito, and the white beans that are standard in baked beans, the standard kind of Boston baked bean. Those are the popular beans that people use a lot, and they're the worst in oxalate. But we're now saying that raw plant foods are infinitely good for you and safe. That's complete misinformation. That's never been true. Humanity in southern US, you take your collard greens and you cook them for 3 hours. It's like you really cook them. And now, ever since sort of the California fresh concept, where you have to have fresh stuff off the truck and eat it just barely cooked or just slightly drizzled with something raw, it's not working out so well. It's a modern concept that we've bought into. Sounds good on the surface. It markets well. It looks pretty in pictures, but it's not working out for our health. It's interesting that you were vegan as well. We both were. Didn't work out.
Yeah. And I don't know that I did it long enough to have really bad effects from it. For me, the reason I quit, because I was only like actually really strict vegan with no dairy or anything like that, like whole food plant-based. And I like to make sure I say that, because people will say, well, vegan's not good enough. Oreos are vegan, and that's true. But I was like whole food plant-based. So I didn't eat any of the like garbage vegan foods. So I don't know that I did it long enough to feel bad, but it was just so hard to stick to for me. And I have friends that have tried it, for a long time. And the problem is you go off of it, you gain weight, you go back on it. Now you're trying to lose weight. And then it's so hard to stick to because it's so unfulfilling for most people that then you want other things and you eat the vegan junk food because you can, and then you gain more weight. And I find that people are very inflamed.
Yeah, we're all really inflamed, and it's a shame that we would do this to our children, just to circle back around to the kids, of hiding these high oxalate foods in things you're giving your kids, soups and meatballs and smoothies and so on. Women are feeling so good about this. They're being trained to do this to their children. And I really wish that we would wake up to the anti-nutrients in plants, particularly the oxalates, because the oxalates have this long repercussion. It makes us inflamed. There's acute inflammation right after you eat it that you often don't notice, but you set up this bioaccumulation problem with oxalate. So oxalate starts hanging around in your tissues. And that's why, as you say, by the time you get in your 40s, you feel like things are falling apart and you start to feel really weighed down and crummy, and you try to get out of bed and you step on your foot and your foot's all swollen, and you have to kind of move around to get the creaks out of your body and wake up your brain with coffee and like push yourself through your life. And you have all these commitments and you've got to show up on time to work and help your kids get to school on time. So you just push yourself through this time of life when you should be at your best, but you feel old and cranky. This inflammation, oxalate's a great promoter of inflammation right in the short term. Right after you have that smoothie full of spinach, you've got damaged immune cells in your bloodstream within under an hour. And even though it takes 8-10 hours for you to fully absorb those foods, now, if you put them in a juice, you're going to increase the speed at which it gets in. And you would think you would have more of a chance to notice that it doesn't feel good, but you don't. A lot of this can be going on without symptoms. In the meantime, you've overwhelmed your bloodstream and your kidneys, whose job it is to get it out of your bloodstream, with too much oxalate, and it tends to hang out in places in your body where you've got regenerating tissue, growing, healing, whatever, inflammation, infection. Those tissues are sticky and oxalate starts accumulating. So by the time you're in your 40s, we've got it in our thyroid gland, our eyes, our kidneys, probably our vascular system, including our heart, muscles, bones, tendons, and so on. And you start getting creaky and old. And then when the few of us who do that find that they could cut out the high oxalate foods, or people coming to carnivore, cutting out all plants together, because that's where the oxalates are hanging out. That's a natural compound that plants make for their own purposes, and it's toxic to us. And it can do this bioaccumulation in modern life because we're eating so much of it and eating it so continuously that your body doesn't have a chance to clear it out. So inflammation is what makes you feel old and cranky.
And so many people go gluten-free because they're trying to be healthy. I was gluten-free for about 10 years before I became a carnivore, but there are lots of oxalates in the substitutes for gluten too, right? So that just compounds the problems that we're already having.
For sure. And most people go gluten-free because of stomach problems. And then you add more oxalate. Oxalate is a great way to mess up your stomach and intestines. Yeah. So the substitutes include arrowroot and buckwheat flour, almond flour, nuts generally. They're all high oxalate foods. They're worse than flour, worse than wheat in terms of oxalate and toxins. And yeah, I think that's the route we go to. When you start feeling bad, you know what's wrong. You have to cut out the wheat and or the dairy. And both of those things are going to increase the toxicity of your diet because you're going to increase the amount of oxalate you're eating. And without calcium is the binder that protects us from oxalate to some degree. So you need calcium not in just in your foods that you're eating to lower how much oxalate you absorb into the bloodstream, but you need calcium to help the body recover from the damage from oxalates and carry it off and take it back out of the body. And if you cut out dairy, you're cutting out 80% of the calcium in your diet. And then you're adding in the gluten-free foods, and depending on which ones you choose, if you happen to like soba noodles, wheat things, or if you like the almond things, both of those are off the charts high.
And so many of us kind of OD on vitamin C when we think we're getting sick or, you know, just at certain times in our lives. And there is a problem with taking too much vitamin C also, right?
Yeah, because it turns into oxalate. That's the crazy thing. It's just vitamin C that's so supposedly so great, and you need lots and lots of it, according to what we're hearing, even though you only need a little bit of it. And your cells do need it. Your immune cells like vitamin C in reasonable amounts, but they can only pick up so much. And using vitamin C as a supplement and taking more than 500 milligrams a day or a couple times a day, you've exceeded the usefulness of it for the most part, unless you're dying of sepsis in the hospital where you really need a lot of C. But vitamin C naturally degrades into oxalate. And what vitamin C can do is get into your cells, and it's in the cells later that it breaks down into oxalate. And then at some point later than that, the cells might release the oxalate back out in the system. So it's hard for people to study this. So there's a lot of confusion in science and a lot of pushback about the idea, because some people use vitamin C as a therapy, IV vitamin C, very high doses, like 60 grams of vitamin C in an IV in an hour or so. That can be very toxic, but you can't necessarily see it in the short run. That's the problem with oxalate. If it was easy to see it, we'd all already know about it. But too much vitamin C alone, apparently, according to medical literature, is enough to cause oxalate poisoning.
And you actually had an issue with vitamin C at one point, didn't you? Didn't I see somewhere that you thought you fell for it too? You thought that vitamin C infusions would be a good idea. And what happened?
Well, see, I worked with integrative healthcare professionals. I worked at UNC Medical School, and we had a whole program on integrative medicine called the program PIM, Program for Integrative Medicine. And I had a colleague friend of mine say, "Oh, I was saying, I had this rash under my ring and it wouldn't go away." And he says, "Oh, that's mercury poisoning, probably. Come to my office. I'll give you friends and family discount and we'll work it out." And so he was giving me vitamin C IVs. And at some point, maybe the 10th or 11th IV, the nurse Mary stuck the needle in there to give me the next IV, and the needle snapped in two. It hit my sinewy, grizzly arms, because what was happening as they were doing the vitamin C is I was becoming harder and harder to stick, because you get these ropey, roly veins, and they were starting to have trouble sticking me. But then this one time, the needle just snapped in two. And I had no idea. She hadn't seen this much at all. This was a unique experience for both of us. But now I realize what had happened is the same nurse, using her favorite spots that she would select on a person's arm, hit a spot right near where she had before. And in that spot, there was oxalate crystal embedded in fibrosis. So it was really in place, firmly in place, not moving anywhere, and hard enough to snap a needle.
That's crazy. And
causes fibrosis. All that vitamin C is already causing oxidative stress, causing oxalate formation in the vascular system, and wrecking my veins and making them all fibrotic.
That's crazy. And we think vitamin C is so good for us, but there is such a thing as too much of a good thing, right?
Well, for sure. I mean, is it a good thing to overdose on anything?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question, because we do tend to think that if a little bit of something good is good for us, that a lot of something good is better for us.
It's the American way.
And when we find something that works for us, we always resort back to our norm. That's why people say, oh, keto didn't work for me, or carnivore didn't work for me. As soon as I went back to eating other foods, I gained the weight back, or I got sick again. Duh. That's why you were sick or overweight in the first place.
Right. So, somehow we've been sold this thing, like if you do the grapefruit diet for 2 weeks, you're fine, you'll be thin, you can go on and have your life again. Just sacrifice on this. Like, no, how you live is creating your reality in terms of your health. If you're tired and overweight and miserable, there's something in the way you're living that's producing that. It's not just lightning out of the sky. It's not random, but it does mean questioning our habits, our likes, our addictions, and freeing ourselves up from that.
Yeah. And so for people who are sick a lot, they take a lot of antibiotics. I know a lot of times oxalate dumping can show up, like people will feel like they have a urinary tract infection and things like that. So the antibiotics, the trauma, the inflammation, all of that can just lead to more oxalate problems. And it ends up being this vicious cycle. We go to the doctor because there's something wrong. They give us an antibiotic we probably don't need because it's probably not going to help with what's actually wrong. And it just ends up being this cycle of over and over again, getting sick and taking medication. And that just makes things worse, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're sort of describing that downward path, and often this starts in childhood, chronic ear infections and yeast infections and sinus infections and this and that. If you're prone to them and they keep coming back or they don't resolve well, your immune system and your barrier membranes that trying to protect you, normally would protect you from getting infections, aren't functioning the way they should. So something's interfering with proper immune function. The only two things that can be is some form of toxicity and some form of nutritional deficiency.
So let's talk about lower oxalate foods for people who think this is insane and there's no way they're giving up all of their vegetables, especially the leafy greens. So what are some things people can eat that will not keep the toxins building up in our system, and maybe help people be able to keep some of those foods in their diet if they choose to?
Most of the leafy greens are not high in oxalate. So all the forms of lettuce are very low in oxalate. Cabbage and all the arugula and watercress and kale and things are fairly low. The highest of those is kale. The green curly kale is the highest of the kale. So if you start getting a little, fine comb to it, you could figure out which kale is low, which is the dino kale. But basically, all the lettuces that are not charred spinach and beet greens. Now, when you buy those mixed lettuces, though, those little like mesclun mixes, they have the little red veins in the leaves. That's the beet greens and the red chard. So those are the ones you don't want. And the spinach is identifiable. That's all. The other leafy greens are fine. And, in the root vegetables, there's quite a few that aren't so great. Carrots, you want to limit that, or portion size. White potatoes are really high, especially the big baking potatoes that we use to make French fries and chips on. They're very high in oxalate. Sweet potatoes, equally, if not worse. So, but turnips, rutabaga, those more cabbage family root vegetables are low. And they're just not sexy and popular at the moment. And rice is pretty low. in oxalate white rice, the bran is where the oxalate hangs out. So you want to not do the whole wheat and whole brown rice and that kind of thing. You use proper organic white rice. There's several fruits that are low. Apples are low and so on. Grapes, melons, the whole cucurbit family. That's the cucumbers, the melons, and the winter squash. That's all pretty low in oxalate. So you're pretty good there. I think yellow squash is one of the summer yellow squash would be the only one that's a little on the high side. So there's basically tons of vegetables out there because the cabbage family is a third of the produce department. And there's plenty of those sort of normal standard fruits that are low in oxalate. And fruits generally are probably a good idea. Things like even the tropical fruits. Coconut's very low. You can use coconut to do the plant milk if you need to do that. Let's see, what else? What did I leave out?
What about berries?
Yeah, so the only really bad ones for sure are blackberries and raspberries. Strawberries are equivocal. It seems like they're the various analyses, they seem to be all over the place. Now, berries have a lot of seeds, which can be a gut irritant. They have some degree of lectins and so on. So it doesn't necessarily agree with you just because it's low oxalate. So blueberries are low in oxalate. The cultivated ones are lower than the wild blueberries. Still, that's talking about portion size, because if you ate 3 cups of them, you've turned a reasonable food into a high oxalate food, just as you were saying, like more is not better. Just because we call it a low oxalate food doesn't mean you can eat it in massive quantities or concentrate it necessarily and have it be a good thing. So even foods that are low oxalate, you may, if you have digestive problems, you may not get along with the blueberry, even if it's low. So it's not about eating by the books or by the numbers so much as it is some combination of awareness and knowledge and what you need to be doing to make your body happy and let it recover from whatever it's struggling with.
So for the people that are ready to make some changes because they're hearing this and they're thinking, wow, my joints are really achy. Is that not really just because I'm, 45 or 50 years old? People who are thinking about doing this, let's talk about what we call oxalate dumping. So this is where your body starts to release all the oxalates that have been building up in your system over the years, and what that looks like, and at what point we should become concerned about our symptoms.
Yeah, this is a really strange thing that isn't, well, no one in medicine is even aware of this problem because they think the bioaccumulation problem, where it's collecting in your thyroid gland and your bones and so on, is only happening after renal failure. And most of us are not in renal failure. But the truth is that by the time you're middle-aged, you have a good 80-something% chance of having crystals in your thyroid gland. And they're there because you've been eating potatoes, peanuts, and chocolate routinely since you were 1. And now that you stop eating these foods, once you get low enough, that gives the body permission to finally clear it out because it is a toxin and the body's managing how much of it's allowed in the bloodstream and the kidneys and so on. And so once the coast is clear, so to speak, and you clean out your bloodstream from repeated attacks of oxalate, the thyroid gland might get in the act, or your tendons in your shoulder might get in the act, or your neck or your bones or body parts are ready to release oxalate. And if this is going on in a very vigorous way all over, you can re-release oxalic acid. It's more toxic than the spinach smoothie. It can make you feel worse for several reasons, because it takes inflammation to get it out of there. So you're already in an inflamed state that can create problems. So this sort of dumping is just the description of when too much of this release is happening. If it's happening just kind of slowly in the background, you may not get any symptoms at all. That you can be recovering from oxalate accumulation in your body with no symptoms. But when too much is happening, that too much means it's now making you feel toxic, and you can see the toxicity where your mood goes to heck, your energy drops, your aches and pains come back, your urine becomes cloudy potentially, because if your kidneys are working well, they can be putting out so much oxalate that it's crystallizing in the urine and making it look kind of milky. So that's one of the key signs to look for. If you have, most of us have pretty good kidneys and they're willing to traffic in this stuff and try to get rid of it for us. That's their job, thankless job that it is. And you can sometimes see it as this milky, cloudy urine. For me, that was the case. But other people get grit coming out of their eyes, extra tartar on the teeth, because the saliva glands concentrate oxalate. So your saliva levels of oxalate go up when you're clearing oxalate. So you might wake up in the morning and see extra junk hanging out behind your incisors and your teeth, or getting other kinds of aches and pains, extra mucus coming out. If the mucosal lining of the bronchial and lung tissues or sinus tissues are releasing oxalate, you'll get extra phlegm. Some people will cough up whole plugs of phlegm with grit in it. Some people will get gritty stools because the colon can turn on its oxalate excretors and remove oxalate from the bloodstream, helping out the kidneys and getting rid of stuff. And you'll get this burning or itching or scratchy stool that might actually look like it's got grit sand in it, sort of tan or black sand or both. Sometimes you'll feel hemorrhoids from that. Or the skin. The skin is the biggest organ of detox. And some people will get rashes, bright red rashes, itch or no itch. Some people get intense itchy problems with their skin. Others get flaking skin, boils, some pretty ugly stuff on the skin. So it could be all kinds of different outward signs that your body is releasing oxalate from the tissue and struggling with it. And it's different in each person.
I know somebody who has been getting chilazons on their eye, like inside their eyelid. Is that a common thing with oxalate dumping?
It is. I never had an eye sty. A sty is another form of these kinds of inflammatory pus blobs that form, or these big swollen areas. I'm still getting eye stuff. I have a little fine one in my upper eyelid right here and some redness around the eyes. I'm under the impression that this junk coming through the eyes is not just the eyes itself. The eyes are a major organ that collect oxalate, unfortunately. And the vitamin C promotes this because eyes like to pick up vitamin C. It's a high vitamin C tissue. And so the vitamin C is another way in which the eyes become high in oxalate. But several researchers are quite clear that eyes are getting that oxalate from the bloodstream, that oxalate itself, oxalic acid coming from the foods, is coming from the blood and filling the eyes with oxalate. So the eyeballs themselves will have oxalate, but all the glands and skin around the eyes, there's many different kinds of glands that allow us to have tears and moisture and all of that around the eyes, seem to be full of oxalate. And as you're trying to push them out, they can cause little plugs in these ducts, and then you get this infection thing. This is really common. I'm under the impression myself that this is the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord tissues pushing oxalate out of themselves would be through the eyes.
So at what point do you go to your doctor and tell him your symptoms that you have and then say, I think I'm dumping oxalates? And what does the doctor say to that? Like, do doctors know about this? And I know it just has to kind of run its course. But at what point does somebody go to the doctor? And then do you try to explain it to your doctor, all these symptoms you're having, when they start diagnosing you with things that you're sure you don't have?
No, you don't have this conversation with your doctor, because they'll show you the exit door and they'll mark you as nut job on the chart. But if you have medical providers and people you're looking to health advice who are at least but open to a conversation, I would suggest you tell them about this book and tell them about my research, and that tell them that you've been eating these foods that are high in its oxalate and you think it's affecting your health, and that you would like them to be aware of that and let them show their true colors. A lot of my clients have told me that they've said, look, this grit that's been coming out of my eyes, look at this stuff. Well, look what's happening. And what is this? I think this is because I changed my diet. And they'll be, that's nothing. That's just old calcium. Don't worry about that. Just ignore that. They're not trained in it. It's not something that they have any reason to know anything about. If anything, they're trained against it, not to be aware of it. And it's really not fitting the way medicine works anymore to hang around and talk about your diet. Anyway, so it's not the most productive forum for figuring out how diet's affecting your health. I mean, I work with people providing some feedback for them, and we can barely get anything done in an hour. There's so much to look at in terms of the history and understanding the symptoms and what's going on with the body, and what are the challenges for the person to find the diet and the foods that are going to help them feel better and get them out of the woods from this process. Because there is a run the course thing where the body just needs time to unload these oxalate deposits. I'm clearly still unloading oxalate deposits, and I'm almost at 10 years of a low oxalate diet of doing this. That's 10 years of eye styes and foot peeling skin and so on. And it gets kind of hard at some point down the road. It starts some people dramatically, and some people, they don't notice any of these oxalate clearing symptoms for years. You can go 3, even 6 years on a full plant-free diet and not notice these symptoms, and then it comes on later. So when the body is able and ready to release oxalate from tissues is completely unstudied. We're just witnessing it and watching this diversity. The diversity is very well documented in the medical literature, that people who are poisoned with oxalate have very different outward signs of the problem, and the whole course of the pathology of it and how it pulls you down is unique to each person. And that's the case with this oxalate recovery process. It's going to be a little different with everybody.
And so if you're interested in starting a lower oxalate diet, you can get Sally's book. There are great lists of vegetables and the oxalate content in them in her book, and that can really help you. Now, some people, when they start doing this, though, they need to slow down the oxalate dumping because their symptoms are so bad. And you recommend just eating little bits of the lower oxalate foods to kind of slow that down, right?
Well, you can use little bits of the high oxalate food. You can have 2 bites of sweet potatoes. I don't really recommend using nuts and seeds because they are so hard to digest. And most of us have digestive problems. And, if you want the ideal gut function as soon as you can get it, which isn't going to be quick with oxalate poisoning. So I don't recommend you use almonds and peanuts and chia seeds and stuff like that to add oxalates back in the diet. So if someone is very low because they're fully meat-based and they're needing to add oxalates, there's lots of things you can do, starting with a strong cup of tea. If you want to have a clementine, there's plenty of foods like that, or 2 bites of sweet potato. It doesn't take that much of the higher oxalate food. So it's not about 0, 0, 0 on high oxalate foods. You can have some olives, this and that. There's plenty of technically high oxalate foods. It's only high if you eat enough of it. It's about the dose. So the standard portion might be a cup and a half of sweet potatoes or a cup of sweet potatoes, and you're going to just have 2 tablespoons of it, or just have 10 olives instead of 30. Technically, if you eat a whole can of olives, that's a lot of oxalate. So all that to just say, you can even have beets or beet juice or spinach juice if you're doing like a teaspoon, 2 teaspoons, and using it medicinally. So it's interesting. It's interesting to try to explain that occasionally adding a few bites of beets to your whatever you're having might be a good therapy for keeping yourself from getting into what you might call an auto intoxication coming from oxalates being released from your tissues.
And the carnivore diet is a great way to eliminate all of those things. Use it as an elimination diet. Some people do it for 30, 60, 90 days. Then you can add things back in one at a time. Something interesting happened to me recently where I had, I cut out coffee. It smelled and tasted like skunk to me. And I wanted to try Dr. Chafee's theory of, going that last 5% carnivore can make 95% of the difference for most people. So I gave it up. And when my taste and smell came back to being normal about a month ago, I added decaf back. Huh?
Well, congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you. It was the weirdest thing. I had the salsa out for everybody in the family. I had made taco burgers and I had the salsa out for everybody on a Tuesday, and it smelled like skunk because of the garlic and onion. And on Thursday, it didn't smell like that anymore. So just like basically overnight, it all came back. And so the very first thing I did was smelled everything in the house, sobbing. I could not believe that I was standing in the refrigerator and smelling things like spaghetti sauce and salsa, things that my family eats, that I don't. That's why I became a carnivore, was because I couldn't eat those things anymore because of the smell and taste. And so I smelled everything and it smelled amazing. And I cried for probably 10 minutes sobbing. I was just so happy. And then the very first thing I did was I made myself a cup of decaf. And coffee tastes really good. I forgot how good coffee tastes. And so I added decaf back in, and I don't drink it every day, but I do drink it most days. And I have found that it makes my thumbs hurt right here in my joint. It's just the most interesting thing. So my point there is that the carnivore diet is a great elimination diet. And then you get to decide, do I want my thumbs to hurt today or not? Like, what am I doing today? Is it important that that my thumbs don't hurt? And so that's just a really interesting thing about being on an elimination diet and then trying to add things back in. I don't plan on adding lots of other things back in. I'm really happy with where I am and I feel amazing, but it's just a really interesting concept that if you cut everything out and then you add things back in one at a time, you notice things like that. And so now today, my thumb doesn't hurt really bad. So I have to decide, do I want to have a cup of decaf when we're done, or do I want to have good thumbs later?
It very well said. I mean, the elimination diet gives you power, and now you can listen to your body. And so I'm almost speechless because it's such a simple tool that people don't take advantage of. And then having that clear sense of choice and authority in your life, it's up to you to choose pain or not.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm probably going to have a cup of decaf, just so you know.
I am very allergic to coffee. Like,
Really?
so allergic, my doctor said your husband shouldn't make coffee at home and you shouldn't hang out in coffee shops. But
Wow.
I used to like things like coffee ice cream, but actually coffee to me tastes a little bit like an ashtray, or it smells like it anyway. And I find it's actually kind of a noxious smell. Maybe that's my body saying, you're allergic to this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Sally, this has been fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to do it again sometime.
That'd be great. Thank
I
you.
appreciate you spending the time with us, and we'll see you next time.